The prophecy of Isaiah. Presentation 33. The prospect of freedom. As usual, let's just look back for a moment or two before we move on. In chapter 51, we have these words, "Hear me, you who know what is right, you people who have taken my instructions to heart. Do not fear the reproach of mere mortals. Do not be terrified by their insults, for the moth will eat them up like a garment, the worm will devour them like wool. But my righteousness will last forever, my salvation through all generations." God is speaking to those who are serious about living God's way and seeking His will. And He's saying you'll find you're at odds with the wider world. Don't be surprised by it, and don't allow the pressures to make you ineffectual. Because in the end, God's righteousness, God's perfect ways, God's rescue, the meaning of salvation, it'll all outlive them. The resistance can't go on forever. Encouragement to a group of people who were facing exile. And Isaiah addresses two problems that the people of Judah had, but we also have today. They had an inadequate understanding of the nature of God. And I venture to say that amongst the people of God, particularly in the West, we have an inadequate understanding of who God is. And we've created a God in our own image. And Isaiah presents, through his careful use of language, a much deeper and more realistic picture of the Lord of glory. But alongside that, the people of God, again particularly in the West, we've lost confidence in who we are in Him. We are not chosen because we're super good or because we've earned it, because we deserve it. No. God has called us that we may live for Him and make Him known. But in Christ, we have everything we need. We need to restore our grasp of this, because when we don't, we tend to look around at all that's happening in our society, and if we're honest and admit it, we get scared. Let's see the greatness and the grandeur of God, and let's see our standing and status through all that He has done for us. Now, this is not some sort of naivety or self-delusion living in cloud cuckoo land. We are going to face things like this. And indeed, many followers of Jesus in other parts of the world are facing brutal oppression from others, in totalitarian states and in Islamic states. And they're the beginnings of it coming in the West. That's real life. But let's never lose sight of who God is and who we are in Him. Let's see the wider reality. Let's keep our trust, our dependence on God, because we know who He is and what He's doing. Because He holds the ultimate destiny, whatever others may do to us. And let us stand firm on that. We saw an overview of chapters 51 and 52, or part of these chapters. The first three sections we dealt with in the last presentation. In this one, I want to focus on that. The first 12 verses of chapter 52. So let's move on. We start with the first three verses. Awake, awake, Zion, clothe yourself with strength. Put on your garments of splendor, Jerusalem, the holy city. The uncircumcised and defiled will not enter you again. Shake off your dust, rise up, sit enthroned, Jerusalem. Free yourself from the chains on your neck, daughter Zion, now a captive. For this is what the Lord says, you were sold for nothing, and without money you will be redeemed. In essence, these are all saying the same thing or driving the same way. Isaiah is addressing the people of God. The people of God who've been threatened, harried, harassed by empires around, and were going into exile under Babylon. In exile, this message was for them. So he's addressing his people. And he's saying that. It's worth pondering that for a moment or two. In our prayers so often we're crying out to God for him to act in the mess of our Western society. And it just seems to get worse. Maybe we're addressing our prayers in a slightly wrong direction. That's what Isaiah would say. The people of Judah were in a far worse mess, politically, organisationally. The suffering they were going to go through, and were going through, far worse than anything we've experienced as yet in the West. And Isaiah is saying to them, wake up, you people of God. Wake up. And perhaps that should be the direction of our prayers. You ended up in this mess. It's your own fault. Others have done it to you, but you deserved it because of your rebellion. You moved out of my protection. You thumbed your nose. You privatized me. But God has not left you. He will set you free. And you don't deserve it, and you don't earn it. And direct divine intervention released the people from exile in Babylon and gave them the opportunity to return and rebuild their land and their city and their temple and become the nation from which Jesus was born. God did it, yes. They didn't bring down the Babylonian Empire. They couldn't. But they have to respond. Now Isaiah paints a picture in the poetry here. Starts with, wake up. God's in action. He's doing it. Wake up. See what's happening. If you like, put on your clothes. Get out of bed. Put on your clothes. Get ready for a day's work. Shake off the dust. Clean the place up. Get ready for things. Take off the chains that are holding you back. Get going. Rise up and sit enthroned. That's our status before God. He has done it for us. He raises us up. We don't deserve it. We don't earn it. We can't impress him. He is gracious. The challenge is to be aroused to a faith response. Stop sitting around wringing our hands with endless prayer meetings. Prayer is great. Prayer is necessary. But there's a moment to wake up and to get ready for action. That's the message Isaiah is saying there. And he goes on, for this is what the sovereign Lord says. At first, that's in the past, my people went down to Egypt to live. Lately, that's in the present, Assyria has oppressed them. And now what do I have here, declares the Lord? For my people have been taken away for nothing, and those who rule them mock, declares the Lord. And all day long my name is constantly blasphemed. Therefore my people will know my name. Therefore in that day they will know that it is I who foretold it. Yes, it is I. The Assyrian leaders blatantly insulted the God, Yahweh, the God of the people of Judah. Subsequently, the Babylonian rulers sacked the temple, stripped it of all its wealth, and they mocked the name of God and declared that their gods were superior. Now the people of God, the small group, the family of Jacob, went down to Egypt by choice. And in due time they were given a piece of land, and they stayed there and they multiplied. It's their choice. till eventually they became too big and a threat to the Egyptians, so they were enslaved. God rescued them. They didn't plan it. They couldn't do it. They were a slave people. And now they'd been ending up with hassle and exile under the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. And this was definitely against their will. But God would rescue them. He prevented the Assyrian ruler from capturing Jerusalem. Hezekiah turned to God and sought God's help. And God was there to help. But they went back to their old ways under Hezekiah's son Manasseh. And Babylon eventually took them over. And these empires considered that their gods, which were just human artifacts, were superior, and they mocked the people of God. They mocked Yahweh. And I see in our media today an almost cynical view. Yeah, you can worship your God in your churches, but don't let him interfere with anything in real life. He's an irrelevance, like all religion. And indeed the ways of Jesus and Jesus himself are mocked openly in the Islamic world. They claim Jesus as a prophet, but they deny his great nature and his reality. And God says, I'll restore my reputation. And I'll restore it by what I do for my people. And I will restore it through my people. God's reputation in the West today depends on the people of God. We have failed miserably. We need to recognize that and to seek God's healing, and that his reputation will be restored. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, who proclaim peace, who bring good tidings, who proclaim salvation, who say to Zion, as God's people, your God reigns. Listen, you watchmen, lift up your voices. Together they shout for joy. When the Lord returns to Zion, to his people, they will see it with their own eyes. Burst into songs of joy together, you ruins of Jerusalem. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord will lay bare his holy arm in the sight of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God. Verses that are often quoted. But it's a picture. These are days before we had any mail service. These are days before we had emails or the social chat lines. And when news had to be spread, the person would send a runner, someone who's fit, who would run. And either by relays or a person on their own, they would run and take the good news to neighbouring cities, neighbouring nations. The news would spread around, carried by people, because there was no other way to carry the news. That's the picture. The news of release from exile in Babylon. God's people could have peace again, and this was good news because God had rescued them. And we have peace because of the good news that God has brought about rescue. And God does it. He's in control. He brought about the circumstances that allowed the people of Judah to return from exile, and to return with the support of the Medo-Persian Empire. But at the spiritual level, released from the bondage to rebellion and self-destruction, that's human life. Peace, genuine peace and security. What the people of Judah longed for, and we long for today, because of the good news that God has brought our rescue. God has rescued us from our own rebellion and self-destructive tendencies. And you'll see this verse quoted by Paul in Romans chapter 10 and verse 15. And Paul is speaking about the great good news of the gospel, the good news of Jesus, which brings peace and security. because God has rescued us from our rebellion against him and given us a new opportunity and a new way and a new future. So it's a metaphor of New Testament salvation. And Paul picks that up very clearly in Romans 10. Now these in varying degrees and in varying ways are speaking about the people of God. People of God who are going to be released, rescued, restored. In fact, the people of God at that time in Judah were in a right mess. Rebellion was everywhere. They were on the road to exile. Then they knew what exile meant, what it would bring about. They saw no future for the nation. They were in an utter mess. And Isaiah is picturing that God would intervene to rescue them. They got themselves in the mess by the rebellion, but God did not let them down. And the people would welcome it, welcome the opportunity to return and start again. And this would be observed by the wider world around. Other people groups who'd gone into exile under the Assyrians and Babylonians, they didn't end up being restored. They were absorbed and disappeared from history. The groups intermingled. But the people of God remained separate and they were brought back. And it had worldwide significance. Isaiah was beginning to get this and grasp this. He passes this message on. The rescue of God's people always has worldwide significance because God's name and reputation stand by his people. But there was even more in this case. Because from that nation, some centuries later, Jesus was born, the servant king. And he changed the world. And he is still changing the world. You'd never guess it from the way the media present things today. But throughout the world, large numbers of people are coming to Jesus and committing their lives to him and finding their liberty, their security and freedom in him. We're declining in the West because of our rebellion. But in every other part of the world, the people of God are growing. Even in Islamic states, where the persecution is acute, the people of God are growing. As people are breaking free from the bondage of Islam and finding liberty and security in the life of Jesus. He's in the business of transforming the peoples of the world. And all ends of the earth will see the salvation, the rescue of our God. And the last two verses of this stretch. Depart, depart, go out from here, touch no unclean thing. Come out from it and be pure, you who carry the articles of the Lord's house. But you will not leave in haste or go in flight, for the Lord will go before you. The God of Israel will be your rear guard. In fact, when the people did leave Babylon, they were allowed to take the artifacts that have been stolen from the temple. And they were given resources and support for the journey by the Medo-Persian Empire. And they were taken back. They were not scurrying away as they did from Egypt, getting to the Red Sea and being rescued by God's great miracle. This time they were supported in their return. But the key point is this. They could have stayed in Babylon. It's a fertile country, great prospects, great wealth. Depart, depart. Now these words are strong. A radical removal. And there's a kind of deep sense here caught in the word in the original. Radical removal. rejecting totally the rebellion of the past, getting out of the pagan surroundings of Babylon, on the way back to rebuild the nation, the people of God. God made the rescue possible. Utterly amazing. But in the end, the people had to choose to be rescued, packing up their belongings and starting the trek back over the mountains and back to their own land. And the strength of the word, it's a call to leave behind the past, to leave behind rebellion and sin, the rebellion that had dogged them in the past. Turn their backs on evil, turn their faces towards God. And it wouldn't be a scurrying away in fear, scared that an army would capture them again. They were given support to go. What a remarkable picture. But that's the fundamental problem that faced them. It was the same people, their descendants anyway, once back in Jerusalem, once back in the land of Judah, but they go back to their old ways of rebellion. Prophet after prophet had called them back. Before that, judge after judge had called them back. And they had drifted back to the ways of rebellion, and leadership had become increasingly corrupted. Would the same happen again? Well, tragically it did in part. But I see God's answer. He saw it. And he saw God's answer lay in a new kind of leadership, described in various combinations, and the picture overall here is the suffering servant king. Seems a strange paradox, a revolutionary idea, because back in their own land, the temptation was just to go back, run their own affairs, lock God up in the temple worship, in the rituals, privatize God, and live for themselves. And to a large extent that's what happened. But the answer would be a new kind of leadership. And in the remainder of chapter 52 and on into chapter 53, Isaiah unfolds this and explains the concept of suffering in a king. Strange paradox. And we'll look at that in the next presentation. But before we go that far, let's look back at what Isaiah already had understood about the servant king, because it leads forward to the new insights at the end of chapter 52 and through chapter 53. So looking back, we had a people group of Israel when it was all one nation, before the northern nation was wiped out. God brought them into existence. Abram, an old man and childless, was promised many descendants, and miraculously it happened. God had protected this people. They were small in number. They were hemmed in by more powerful nations and people groups all around them. And he gave them instructions for the best kind of lifestyles they could have. Instructions given to them as they travelled throughout the desert, moving towards the land that God was giving to them. How are you to live? When we look at these instructions, we have to interpret them in the context of the time. They were light years ahead of the law codes of other nations. And in fact, most other nations didn't even have law codes. It was a level of quality living that had never been seen in the world. You see, we look at it from now backwards. And it's easy to be critical. But in the context of the time, it was radical and revolutionary. And it did lead and could lead to great quality. Not a rule book, but instructions. And he gave them a land, a strategic land, a land that was a bridge between Africa, Europe, and Asia. A land where trade routes crossed. A land where people moved around. Communications were there. God did all of that through this people group, he would be made known to wider humanity. That was their role. Live the quality of life under the instructions he gave, and that quality would reflect the nature of God, and God's nature is centrally love. His agenda is the best for the other person, and when we live without agendas, the best for everybody around us. Doesn't matter who they are, what they've done, whether they deserve it or not, even whether they appreciate it or not. That transforms, totally transforms living. And to share that understanding, using their strategic position and communications, to share their understanding of God as he showed himself to them with the people groups round about. Sadly, that's what happened. And the people of God divided in two. The northern group were wiped out by the Assyrians to disappear from history. And the southern group, the people of Judah, were left, and Isaiah was speaking to them, and they were failing too. You see, that's what we always do. They saw themselves as superior, God's chosen ones. Selfish. Stop and think. How many Christian groups today have drifted that way and are still drifting it that way? We've got it right, we've got the answer, we've got our meal ticket to heaven. I parody, but there's an element of truth in it. We carry out the religious ritual correctly. Our leaders are appointed by the correct hierarchy. The rest are not. We've lost God's vision to live for the benefit of others, no matter who they are, what they think, what they believe, and to make God known to them. And the leadership in Judah and in Israel before it had become self-serving. Basically, they were lining their own pockets and giving themselves a great lifestyle at the expense of the majority. And I wonder today in our Christian groups, and I say this with gentleness and with love, have we got a leadership that's self-serving, self-perpetuating? I leave you to ponder that one through. But in the end, the people of Judah, they failed to live up to the life pattern that God had given them, his directions, his instructions. And their behavior was a little different from the surrounding people groups. Oh, stop again for a moment. Look at the church in the West. Research studies have shown that the ethical and moral and social behavior of the church people of today is little different from our surrounding wider society. That should not be so. We have failed to live up to life pattern. And yes, some of our leaders have hit the media with dreadful things that they have done. But it is only a minority. But we're all tarred with the same brush. But overall, we have failed. And probably that is one of the most fundamental reasons, this picture, why the church in the West is declining. We're heading for exile. We're being marginalized, trampled through, and we've brought it on ourselves. Isaiah saw the inevitable consequences. He tried to persuade the leadership in his early ministry to trust God and restore God to the center of national life. But Ahaz wouldn't listen. Didn't work. Hezekiah did a lot better. A good king in many ways. He did restore God's place at the center of national life against considerable resistance. But in the end, he still relied on improving his fortifications and his armaments. And he also formed treaties with the rising empire of Babylonia in an attempt to resist Assyria. Isaiah was furious. But his son Manasseh, he went to the extreme. God was pushed aside, and all kinds of thoroughly evil things went on in the land. And people suffered horrendously. Not a good picture. And when we look at society through the lens of history, we see the corruption of the nation, the people of God, just growing. Ups and downs, yes, but the trend was downwards. And Isaiah saw that the real threat was Babylonia, not Assyria. He saw the entire land overrun. He saw Jerusalem sacked, the temple flattened. He saw the kingly line coming to a sad and violent end. And he saw large numbers being deported to Babylonia. And it all happened. But he went further. Isaiah understood that the people of God had brought all of this on themselves by their rebellion. But he went behind the scenes and he realized that despite all they'd done and all their failures, God, by his grace and his goodness, had not written them off. He saw the exile wouldn't last forever. Indeed, he saw that it would be an empire from further to the northeast that would release them. It happened. And he saw the people would be allowed to return, and indeed encouraged to return. But he recognized that's what would happen, and that was the answer. What an understanding, what a depth of insight. We can learn so much from this. The answer that Isaiah saw was the coming of a new kind of king, described as a servant king, because he would rule for the benefit of the ruled. Now there's a novelty in those days. And sadly it's often a novelty today, although some great people have ended up in political leadership. But that makes it even harder to understand. A suffering king. Because this coming person would deal with humanity's root problem. The fact that the people of God couldn't cope, they kept drifting back to rebellion, and humanity was in rebellion against God. The picture is vividly true for us today. How on earth would that work out? A suffering servant? What kind of leadership was that? This was something very, very different. But Isaiah grasped these things because he had grasped more about the nature of God. Remember, I said that we've got to understand the nature of God better. Puts everything into a perspective. But he was a realist. He understood the nature of humanity and our persistent desire to run our own things, do it our own way, and ignore God. Push him to the margins of life. Take our own decisions. And from that he could see how God would work, how God was working. And that led to this. It's worth pondering again that picture. We've got lessons to learn in the West today. That's the starting point. Grasping the nature of God and being realistic about who we are and our failures. The coming king would be a ruler bringing security and justice. That's a good picture. He would be a rescuer, bring salvation, dealing with human rebellion. That's a good picture. He would release humanity and beyond the nation of Judah. That's a good picture. But how is it going to work out? And he works that through in the remainder of chapter 52 through 53. But he's already developed many ideas in previous sections. I'm summarizing these, and the summaries are somewhat inadequate. God was going to intervene in a coming king, born as a child, an infant, vulnerable child, who bring perfect divine rule with peace, justice, and righteousness. In chapter 11, it shows that the king would come from the line of Jesse. That was the father of David. With divine power, bringing absolute justice, make society, bring it to be correct. He would rule with genuine righteousness. He would do what was right and perfect. And that was in contrast to the rulers of the days of Judah. He'd be fully equipped by God's power in the Spirit, bringing justice to the world. Let's remember again that word justice. He would put things right. He'd be sustained by God. He'd deliver humanity from the darkness that we've brought on ourselves. Darkness because we push God to the side and try to live our lives our own way. But he would never force it on us. And he would succeed where the nation of Judah had failed. And he would offer this rescue, this transformation to the wider world. But Isaiah saw the task would be very frustrating. But the wider world could be released from violence and evil, to enjoy the kind of rich quality of life that God intends for us. He would listen to God, implying he would obey. He'd be equipped to help others because he'd listened and been taught. But he would be rejected and abused by many. But he wouldn't retaliate. What kind of king is that? And following and obeying the servant would be equivalent to obeying God. Isaiah spelt that out very clearly. What kind of human was that? What kind of leader was that? And the section we'll look at in the next presentation. How on earth does suffering fit into that? Isaiah gives us new insights and understandings of that aspect of this coming king. A king? A picture of a king? A king who would serve and bring benefit to the led? Well, perhaps they could grasp that, but a king who would suffer for the benefit of humanity? That's mind-blowing. It didn't stop there, but I'm not going to put down any more, because as we come to later chapters, we will find more insights that Isaiah brings to us about the coming king, the suffering servant king. In a sense, servanthood is the center of the entire book. The people of God, we are called to God in order that we will serve wider humanity. Because God wants to rescue wider humanity. And he does it that way. We serve humanity. And as we serve humanity, we make God's saving power known to the world around. That's what Judah was supposed to have done. It failed. That's what we, the people of God today, are supposed to be doing. And certainly in the West, we haven't come up to the mark. Isaiah saw, he understood clearly that the people of Judah, they were in no fit state to fulfill the destiny that God had planned for them. They had messed up good and proper. But he saw that where the nation had failed, the servant king, the suffering servant king, would succeed and would go beyond it, would restore the people of God, equip them to fulfill the task. And in some ways, in reality, He would make it possible for humanity to be restored from their rebellion against God. It was a totally new way of looking at leadership in the days of Isaiah. Leaders were all powerful, beyond contradiction, and at the flick of a finger they could command the execution of someone or force some law through or do anything to anyone. God's leadership never works that way. God's leadership reflects his own nature, and his nature is love, which means that God's agenda is the best for you and me all the time, no matter how much we mess up. But what Isaiah was grasping, and he spells it out and explains it in a bit more detail in the rest of the chapter and the following chapter. This coming servant king was prepared to serve God by suffering on behalf of others. And allowing himself to be defeated, he gained the ultimate victory. It's a very, very deep thought that we in the West have got to come to terms with. The victory of God comes through the defeat of those who are obedient to God. That is the prophecy of Isaiah. Having painted in the background in this presentation, we'll move on to look at Isaiah's explanation of the suffering servant.